So sorry guys for coming in so late, but I'm running between conferences and then I had to chair the other one in another system. So I'm a bit confused on switching from one system to another. Even when you have digital skills, this is digital confusion. So yeah, Tony and Tanya invited me to present at this session. This is a work in progress. I have to be honest with that. There are some things which I need feedback on in, how do you say, clarifying, getting the themes better, etc., etc. But the work I'm presenting here is based on the work on the shoulders of the giants, the team of the African Digital Rights Network researchers from 10 different countries who have conducted a research on the digital rights situation in 10 countries. And what I did is take that work and derive from there the situation related to COVID-19 and what impact it had on digital citizenship. Tony, could you go to the next, please? So from the description in the program, you will notice that this is a comparative study based on what I would say secondary material. I have not conducted the interviews, collected the reports, etc. myself. Those were created by my fellow research colleagues in the network. What I did is took that material and understood what they derived from it and synthesized this analysis in which I derived the themes which were related to COVID-19. So this is the abstract summary, which I will present in the next following slides. Next slides, please. The material being used in this analysis is presented here. It's the report which you see on the left-hand side of this slide. It's a summary or a report based on 10 country reports from various countries across the continent of Africa. The sampling of countries is interesting because it spreads the whole geographical area. It looks at various ranges of civic space openness or closeness, so to speak, political dimensions, internet freedom, etc. And bear in mind, that's something we have to look further into the research, is that these are, let's say, languages non-francophone, so to speak. So there may be some differences and we have to address it later, but for the remainder of the text, I will only talk about these countries. The data collection of these reports more or less coincided with the situation of COVID-19 starting, and for us bringing as a network an opportunity to look further into what COVID-19 had influence and what way it influenced, let's say, the digital space, the civic space. The method I applied for identifying, let's say, the themes was a qualitative research approach, meta-analysis of secondary data, taking a thematic analysis approach in which I derived, let's say, identified themes from the literature and saw also whether they resemble the things I found in the data, and sometimes new things popped up. And so then that was, let's say, coded in a bottom-up approach. That is more or less the way it has been handled. Next slide, please. This research focused on a few concepts which I have stipulated here. Tony, Robert, and Tanya Bosch have extensively written for our team about digital citizenship. From there, I adopted a definition on digital citizenship. I've looked further in the aspects of digital rights in online civic space. There are many different definitions for these, but it is interesting to point out that the online civic space, which let's say in the digital world, has provided some freedom measures which are being used by citizens for expressing their voice, their criticism, towards actors like the government or other speakers. And I have derived a definition from Civicus to exemplify what activities they are used for. The research has shown 7 themes, preliminary themes, so to speak, because I do feel that there is room for improvement, and I'm really looking forward to your comments to see in what way I could improve, let's say, this analysis. The 7 themes I will try to summarize in the next slide. But what I noticed is that there are, let's say, things related to COVID-19 which have, let's say, had an impact on the economic side, so to speak, the affordability of data for using social media, mobile phone, internet, etc. Aspects which are related to the way citizens speak up online. And COVID-19 has created not only, let's say, a dampening effect, it also has created possibilities for citizens to show up and be present online. COVID-19 was also a kind of reason for governments to experiment with technologies to follow their citizens, for example, for health purposes, to contact tracing, but also to see how to follow citizens and organizations to muzzle their voice, to curb the digital rights, so to speak. And in some instances, and even recently, we noticed shutdowns in some of the countries who investigated in this network. For example, the Twitter ban in Nigeria recently. Another thing what occurred was that a lot of misinformation has been spread around, anti-vax information, medication, what turned out to be not a medication against COVID, etc. This kind of information was spread and sometimes combined with other messages people wanted to send out, alienating people towards each other, etc. And in essence, also COVID-19 seems to be a fruitful situation for a lot of parties to enter what I would say a market and sell their stuffs, their goods, their technologies towards governments. So these are more or less the themes I identified within the research. Next slide, Tony. For each of the themes, I will briefly highlight some of the key findings. When we look at the affordability aspect, COVID had, let's say, different effects in different countries. In many of the countries, prices went up. Price hikes were introduced because, call it demand and supply capitalism or whatever. More people used their phones, smartphones, computers, etc., to access internet, social media, to get new information, and extensively use their devices to get in touch with others or to buy supplies or for other means. And this meant that the demand went up, and so telecom operators increased their prices. In some countries, however, prices were kept low because governments realized that this was the means of communication for many of their citizens. And so we see a different pattern here, that some of the countries left this to the market, to capitalism, to see what happened, and others imposed regulations to keep price cap. Citizens, because of the fact that that there was curfew imposed, couldn't go on the streets to protest, and in some instances they used the online space, the public space, to present their concerns and to organize their protests. And in many instances, we have seen that hashtag campaigns were run, sometimes in multiple languages, local native languages in a country, including English, to get, let's say, kind of public international audience. This is something we have to look further into the I would call it the multi-language social media space, which creates a kind of task for researchers to see what kind of messages are spread and to whom and for what reason. Sometimes my impression was that the English hashtags were used to get the attention of the international media instead of being addressed to, let's say, local fellow citizens. In many cases, social media was being used to, or sometimes websites, for holding the government accountable, looking at ways governments were spending money intended for COVID measures. This has led, in many cases, to pushbacks by the government in many ways. Some of them will be, let's say, stipulated in the next themes. Okay, COVID also presented a way for digital technologies to show their potential for, how do you say, containing the spread of the virus. And for this, digital contact tracing applications were used. Not all the studied countries introduced, by the way, these contact tracing apps. There were many reasons why they didn't. The complexity, how many people are using devices. Many times, multiple people are using the same device. So would it be wise to use a digital contact tracing app? Or would it be more wise to inform people instead of using, let's say, contact tracing applications? So this is something to investigate further. What are the the reasons why? Please wake me if I'm over time, Tony. So digital contact tracing apps were not used by all the countries we have seen. What we noticed is an increase in surveillance and online privacy deterioration across all the countries, so to speak. It's unclear from the data what parties are mostly involved, meaning with parties, what commercial vendors are helping these governments to establish their capabilities for surveillance. Many times governments procured new technologies to do so. On the civic space side, NGOs are trying to investigate what governments are buying, what kind of technologies to do these things. Not specifically mentioned in reports in this network, but derived from the literature. I noticed that many of the Western countries are actually selling these technologies, whereas Western countries also present themselves as the guardians of digital and human rights. So it's a thing which should be addressed further. Across many of the countries, we also notice introduction of new regulations or sometimes appropriation of existing regulations for COVID. Two prime examples are Egypt, where NGOs were call it muzzled by new NGOs legislation, and in Nigeria, where the health emergency bills were used to curb what the government considered misinformation or information not aligned with the policies of the government. Next to the regulations, we also saw, let's say, physically shutting down the access of internet as a whole or specific website or social media accounts by various governments, and sometimes not shutting down physically, but creating an additional hurdle by mandatory identification of people who produce content, so to speak. So bloggers were obliged to identify themselves, so they are known, and so more hesitant to be very critical against the government. As mentioned before, infodemic is a kind of second wave online viral effect of the COVID. Much information, fake news, so to speak, has been spread. Not necessarily only about COVID, but sometimes aligned with other political messages in many of the countries. And this is something which needs further dissection to see why it happened and in what case it was used by whom. So these are more or less, in a nutshell, the themes I identified from the analysis of the African Digital Rights Network reports. Tony, can we go to the next? And I'm trying to summarize and finish. So for the audience, the things I've seen is that COVID-19 definitely had influence on the online space. It has been used as an excuse for limiting the space. Lawfare has been conducted by governments. They use several frames, and two are interesting for that matter: the health safety concern or the national security concerns. And many of these things led to disadvantages, or let's say enhancement of the disadvantage of the underprivileged. And on ending in a positive note, it is a double-edged sword. It had negative impact, but there are some positive things from social media use in COVID-19. But what I noticed and explained by Marabelli and Fast and Lee is it will leave some digital scars, COVID-19. And so I'm very much interested in your questions and feedback on how to see what digital scars are left by COVID and what impact it will have on the online civic space and what research avenue the network, African Digital Rights Network, should take for that matter. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you. I think I'll stop sharing the screen and then we'll be able to see more of each other for the discussion. So thank you, Anna. That was a difficult task you had there, kind of summarizing across the 10 country reports that the African Digital Network had produced and pulling out the sections from those reports on COVID to find those emerging findings and themes. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and comments. I'm going to open the floor, and I can already see some very clear links between Anand's presentation and Rin's, which is about kind of the use of digital for mutual aid in India, and Corella's more about the use of digital for use of social media for protests. So some clear links to the two presentations that will follow. But first, questions and comments from you to Anand. You can put your hand up, or you can just turn your mic on and start talking. That would also be fine. And then just whilst other people are formulating questions, one of the things you spoke to there relates to some other work that you know the African Digital Rights Network are working on, and this is surveillance law. You said that there were kind of two main framings that governments were using to give themselves, at least two, to give themselves permission to conduct surveillance in times of COVID. And one's kind of national health emergency, and the other, if I understood you correctly, was like national security.
Yeah.
Frames are sometimes written into legislation and sometimes less formally used, but even when they're written into legislation, they're not defined. So there's a piece in the legislation that says the government may violate the right to privacy and conduct surveillance if the following conditions prevail. And one of the conditions is
so it's overruling, let's say,
security.
basic primary rights.
So one of them is national security, but the legislation that I'm reading, we're looking at 6 African countries, never defines what is actually meant by national security, which means the government can just do whatever it wants whenever it feels like. So how did that issue come up in your research?
I'm not exactly, it's difficult to pinpoint what the reason was, but sometimes I feel that governments are looking at each other and the playbook is rolled out, for example, in the US first, and then it has been copied, etc. So as we have seen, for example, with the British, the election, the fake news influencing the election, it has been rolled out later in some African countries by firms which were involved. And it may be that with writing up this legislation, and that's something we could look into later, is who are the parties involved with writing up the legislation. I don't think it is the government themselves who sometimes make this. And there can be other parties involved who have helped them craft the text. And it could be that they have looked at each other and reused, let's say, some of these things in a playbook manner to create, let's say, the carte blanche they need for do whatever they want. And it's maybe almost like a conspiracy theory approach I would have. But as a researcher, we always look at themes which are cross boundaries, so from one discipline to another, etc. Why are these governments not doing the same, that they are looking at each other's work and say, hey, what the US has done after 9/11 is applicable in my case, in my country. Of course, they learn from each other. So I do think that these two frames are widely known and widely used, but sometimes they just phrase the language a different way, approach to get, let's say, contextual power. So it's I don't think it is very rocket science to come up with these frames, but it could be that other parties are involved in helping them to write up these things. And what might be interesting for us to see if we can garner open data information on the parties involved in the development of the legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a couple of things that emerging from this surveillance law research is there are some draft templates for this legislation, positive ones. So the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights was part of a process, and so if you Googled draft legislation surveillance law UN, there's a template for good law that does protect rights. And Privacy International and EFF published something called Necessary and Proportionate, which is another framing of good privacy surveillance law. However, there are examples of countries like Germany that have extremely good surveillance law, lots of protections, checks and balances, safeguards, so that all surveillance, according to law, is very narrowly targeted at somebody who we have reasonable grounds is just about to commit a terrorist act. But if the same legislation has got these vague terms like national security or national health emergency in it, that's just a get out clause. So I think we need to kind of look very closely at how those framings and those words are being mobilized to enable surveillance and the violation of privacy.
Tony, I think there are several good frameworks across the world which can be applied in this case, we can learn from and try to have, but the frameworks are not legislation yet, they are recommendations. And so it's what process is there to get, let's say, the best of these frameworks into the process of the writing of the legislation in a specific country. And there is where civic space, civic power, civil society is needed, not only in identifying the frameworks, but lobby power to get it into the writing process. That's where I think is more necessary. The openness, the let's say the vagueness creates a void in which, let's say, the sinister powers can take more than you want.
Yep.
But having said that, I disagree with the fact that German is a good example, and I will explain. There is a bias towards who this legislation is being used against. And if you have, let's say, a darker skin tone, I'll not mince words, you have a non-Christian religion coming from a MENA region, chances are much more higher that you will be prosecuted with this legislation than when you are a white armed forces ex-military person who is planning an attack on the German parliament.
Sure.
And media has shown that my case is not theoretical.
Sure.
And this is the same in the way German is prosecuting people. So even very good specific legislation doesn't mean it's being executed in an equal or equity manner in society. So there is another aspect we have to see, and it's the checks and balances. So the writing of the legislation and then the monitoring and evaluation side by non-governmental actors to see it is being used equally across all citizens. And that aspect is necessary as well.
I have lots more to say on that issue, but I didn't mean for us to go quite so far down that particular rabbit hole. So let me come back to you offline about that, Anand.
Sure.
Other
Sure.
different questions for Anand or comments on his presentation and paper?
I had a comment at the end, and I was trying to tease out a little bit of your feedback on that. That is, what would be an everlasting effect of this COVID, the digital scars? So as some authors mentioned, I'm wondering on, has COVID created an earthquake effect that things have shifted and civic space has been reduced, but will this be for not temporarily, but for a longer time or period? That is actually the question I would like to raise back to the audience here. And if some people want to use the chat for that, I would happy to read it later, so then we can continue. But that's what is playing in my mind, Tony.
Anybody want to come back to Anand on that issue?
Hi, Tony. Just to say that was going to be my question for Anand. Thanks for the presentation. I was going to ask about the enduring impacts of COVID, and I guess there's one side to it where COVID becomes this exceptional kind of event, and this we think it's changed everything, and we're never going to be the same again. Or if we think about the way that pandemics have worked in history, and the way that, in a sense, they throw a light on, the kind of fault lines in society, and is it that COVID is helping just to cast a light, or is it's acting as a mirror? Maybe it might magnify certain things, or so I wondered where you fell. Is it this exceptional event, or is it something that is more like a mirror that may magnify certain things at a particular time? Or I don't know, do we have to choose either or? Because these are the kind of two frames I was thinking about it from. So I don't know if that's me sort of passing the ping pong ball back across to your side of the fence.
Well, I do need this ping-ponging because I see Becky reacting with shock doctrine, and that is running in my mind as well. Like, is this being used? Is it being abused? Can we push back? Can we as a network identify and say, hey, we see this playbook being used? And there I am stopping with my answer because I don't know what the situation will be like.
And I wonder if...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, George, and then Becky.
Sorry, I just wonder if the way forward might be to go country by country, and if in fact we might not be able to have a general answer to these. We may start to see patterns, but maybe the answer may start from the country kind of level analysis, because it does feel like, for example, for Zimbabwe, COVID just cast a light on certain processes that had already been in play, things that we had already seen, because there already was an authoritarian government that was in play. There are a number of different factors, you know, that explain how we came to be where we are, and key moments, for example, the 2017 coup back, you know, and the army backing this current government. So COVID comes into the mix, but in a sense, it's coming into a kind of a landscape that's already structured by certain, you know, political factors that have taken place. So, you know, like any other crisis, you know, that whole thing, never let a good crisis go to waste. They seize on it and they make hay with that crisis. I love mixed metaphors, so forgive me. So I might throw another one about fishing in there, so bear with me. So, but I guess the point I'm making is it might be that if we start from the country level and rise up, maybe there's that one kind of case where Zimbabwe is an exemplar of one set of things where we have a sort of long-standing, kind of longue durée kind of approach where there's a long-standing process that's happening, and COVID simply helps us to see it more clearly. But it may be that in another country, we have a different kind of, you know, trajectory. But yeah, so sorry to hog the mic.
And just before Becky comes in, and I remember that in the Zambia report, the authors wrote, this thing they're doing with using COVID for authoritarian measures isn't new in Zambia. We saw it before in previous cholera outbreaks.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not just that we're copying authoritarian measures from other countries, it's also within the country's own history. There have been previous crises, and it's
cholera,
interesting to
Ebola
look at
situations.
Yeah,
has
exactly.
been used.
Becky,
so
sorry, I promised you the floor and then I hugged it. Go ahead.
Just to say, I think this is a kind of general observation that I think in terms of people and their views about rapid digitization, I think this is actually quite a kind of fruitful moment to have difficult conversations about rapid digitization, and that everybody's experiencing it, whether it's like you can't use cash to go on the bus anymore, or shops, especially around that financialization moment of the death of cash. So actually, I think in terms of kind of public-facing activism and kind of policy engagement, it's actually kind of a moment where you can have those conversations with people and people kind of get it. And unfortunately, quite a lot of the time it tips over into Bill Gates is injecting us with 5G or whatever it is. But actually, I've had loads of conversations with people who would find those kind of conversations really boring and nothing to do with their lives. And I just think in general, this is quite a kind of fruitful moment to be talking about what rapid enforced digitization means. That doesn't mean that we can stand up to the platform or anything like that, but I think it is an interesting kind of political moment.
Becky, can I rephrase this as we have the opportunity to frame this, a counter narrative frame we can use to get the attention?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And especially when people start in on the kind of Bill Gates 5G narratives as well, because I think that's what's disturbing, is that so much of the disinformation is that kind of, it's actually hitting some kind of sweet spots about surveillance capitalism, but going in crazy directions. And so you're seeing these kind of weird allegiances between new age people and the far right across Europe.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, we see these horseshoes occurring. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting approach you have. You say the disaster provides an opportunity to have this hard and critical talk about the rapid enforced digitalization, and like, let's say, with the cash money issues now, etc. So instead of the disaster, you see the opportunity for conversation. How can we as a network use this? Is there a chance for we should approach it thematically in activities or the way we communicate?
Well, I think, Anand, you said your paper's work in progress, and it looks like there's some more work to be done on the kind of so what questions, right? So you've pulled out themes, you've found those emerging narratives, but you haven't yet got to the point where you're like, well, so what? What does this mean for policy, for practice, for future research? And in answering those questions, I think you will get to what you were looking for there is what are the opportunities here for practice, policy, and further research. And I think, this is a thing that will definitely come up in Corelli's presentation, and maybe even Rin, is that it's at moments of social contention when things are bad and liberal democratic options are not available, that new narratives, counter narratives emerge. And in a sense, that's what we're talking about here. How is this framed in a way that captures positive potential and not just a cataloguing of the doom and gloom, which we're very good at generally.
Thank you, Tony. I think that's good. And Becky's point and George's point, I think we can seam into one thing. I can further work on the paper, but also on this so what aspect, because the trajectories mean sometimes different things in different settings and contexts and different frames of conversation and having impact. So thank you.
Good. That feels like a good place to wrap that up, if that's okay, Anand, and move on to either Rini or Corelli. Is anyone volunteering, preferring to go next, or shall I point a finger? Corelli.
Happy to go next.
Was that you, Rini?
Yeah, Corelli, if
Okay.
you'd like to go next, I mean, whoever, not a problem.
You go ahead, Rini. Why don't you, are you going to share your screen?
Yes, yeah. I'll just do that.
Great. Yeah, because I think there's some clear connections between Anand's paper and yours, Rini.
Yes, that's what I was also thinking while listening to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, we've got plenty. We're on time, and we have plenty of time. But I'll start waving bits of paper at you after about 15 minutes. Okay, we're seeing your screen.
Is the presentation
That's your
visible?
presentation. And if you can just make that full screen now, we're ready to go.
Yeah, just a second.
That's it.
Yeah. Hi, everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Tony. My name is Rini Sinha, and I'm currently working as a project manager with the London-based charity SHM Foundation. And a lot of my work is around creating mobile phone-based support groups for vulnerable populations to support their mental health needs and well-being. And my interest in digital actually started during my master's when I was working on my thesis. And in today's presentation, as is evident from my title, I'm going to speak about something which is as recent as a month back. So my data is also limited in the sense that the data that I'm going to speak about or that I have analyzed mostly comes through me. And I understand that my position as somebody who's based out of New Delhi in India in an urban background is a limited take on this. But since this is a work in progress, I hope to hear from you your thoughts and hopefully add more data to it as time passes. So today's presentation is about the emergence of citizen-led health intermediaries during the recent devastating second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in India. So I'll start by giving a little bit of context as to what was exactly happening in the country. So as is evident from these headlines on these slides, India is a democratic country and every citizen has the right to access healthcare and medical facilities. And essentially, health is a state subject. So the individual states are responsible in terms of looking after the healthcare. But the central government also plays a role in terms of allocation of resources and medical facilities. But when the second wave hit the country was completely unprepared for it. Oxygen, medical supplies were in complete shortage. Relatives and patients' attendants were running around from pillar to post at a time when the infection was at its peak, just trying to arrange for these resources. So essentially, there was a gap at two levels. The first was a lack of healthcare facilities. So in terms of oxygen, hospital beds, medicines, all of that. And the second problem was that there was no reliable information as to how to access these medical facilities. What are the rules and regulations? Because there were no official sources, or there was just no clarity from either the central government or the state government as to how to access these resources. So there was an information deficit, and there was a complete breakdown of the public health information infrastructure, so to say. So it was within this environment and this crisis situation that these citizens literally took matter into their own hands, as the title of my presentation says, and decided to create these knowledge repositories through social media. So as you can see on this slide, these are just a few examples of what a typical day on Instagram looked like, because it was flooded with such pleas looking for medical supplies and medical facilities. So citizens decided to actually start posting information in the form of health intermediaries, as I would expand later, which had information about resources, medical resources, food, etc., and how to access those resources. So through this presentation, I'm going to use three concepts essentially: digital affordances, collective action, and health intermediaries, just to understand how it played a role in disrupting the traditional public health information system in India. And also who benefited from this system, and who were the people who were actually using social media to post these resources or create these health intermediaries. So these are some of the topics that I'm going to touch upon in today's presentation. So as I mentioned, these are the three concepts that I have used for my analysis. Just a brief overview. So digital affordances is the main concept that I'm used, and it basically concerns what action possibilities a particular technology allows, which in this case is going to be social media. The term collective action, I'm going to use that to analyze how citizens, I mean, not only patients, the attendant of patients or their family, but regular citizens also became a part of this citizen-led movement. And the third concept is about health intermediaries and how they played a role in creating these health intermediaries, which played a very crucial function in order to enable people to access the right facilities and the right information. So digging further into this, so I think the first positive affordance which social media allowed was, of course, mass dissemination of information. This was a time when it was the safest to just be home and not step out. So what social media allowed was for people to both search and share information while sitting within the confines of their home, rather than becoming vectors of transmission at a time when the wave was at its peak. So these are some of the examples of how the information was being shared. I thought it was quite interesting to highlight that there was a specific language and terminology which emerged when these posts were being shared. So for example, resources, the term lead was very often used when information was being shared about oxygen resources or medicines. The term amplify was again being used along with, say, hashtags of specific city names, for example, Delhi here. So people would just use the hashtags to leverage the social media algorithm in a way that people in that particular location would probably be able to access those posts better. The second thing was providing time-sensitive information, which was extremely crucial in the second wave. And that is also an important function of a health intermediary, of providing time-sensitive information to patients' attendants. So during the second wave, it was usually around the 5th or 6th day of the infection that the patient's oxygen would suddenly dip and they would need medical attention. So as the days passed, people realized that providing time-sensitive information was very important. And just building on the argument about language and terminology, as you can see in these examples, the words verified, personally verified, these started accompanying the COVID resource posts. Eventually, timestamps were mentioned on the post so that people who were actually accessing this would know exactly when the information was verified, so that they could accordingly take a call on whether to pursue this particular source or not. The third thing, which is about collective action and mutual aid. So in a paper written by Postmus and Suzanne in 2002, in which they discuss about the various ways the internet enables collective action, they make an argument about how non-activists also become a part of the so-called activism when it happens online. So just building on that argument, of course, this to call this activism would probably not be right, but what was happening was that there was an information overload on social media, right? And as I mentioned, time was very critical. So there were these WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups that were formed where volunteers themselves, who I would like to refer to as the non-activists in these cases, they volunteered their time and decided to personally verify information. Creating a sort of a mutual aid structure in an environment where information and getting access to the right facilities at the right time was very crucial. So these were some of the positive things that social media afforded in a time of acute crisis. But I think Anand also was discussing it towards the end of his presentation. There were also some things which were not exactly positive that were emerging. Of course, the very obvious one was the digital divide, because India is a country where some people do not even have access to a smartphone. So it's not that they'll be able to access internet. Then, of course, there are literacy issues as well, specific tech literacy issues when it comes to using the mobile phone. So most of this information, was targeted at the major cities, the tier 1 cities, and people who could understand and access this information. So for people in the smaller cities or in the rural areas, it was all the more difficult or probably not even possible to access this information that probably provided a ray of hope to people in the major cities. The second problem that emerged was of privacy concerns, because social media was flooded with numbers and a lot of people and a lot of fake numbers, unfortunately. So a lot of people who were not even engaged in any of these COVID related activities were inundated with calls to the extent that they would have to switch off their numbers. So this was the picture in the initial, say, 1 week or 8 days of the second wave of the pandemic. And official sources of information or government sources of information were not exactly very useful at this point. But gradually we saw the emergence of state governments and even the central government on social media in a very targeted way, in a way providing information that would actually be useful. So here, for example, this is an example of a state government that had created a dashboard in order to track hospital beds with all the information in one place. This was also something similar to the kind of models that citizens had created. So there was a Twitter bot that could help you find information in real time. There were a lot of Excel sheets and similar websites that had come up, which were sharing or compiling all the resources together. So that was one of the first steps that the government, the first targeted step, I would say, that the government took in order to provide information. This was also the time when, since there was a lot of information overload, it also opened up the space for a lot of fraudulent practices. The case that I would like to elaborate on is about the drug remdesivir, which was the prescribed drug in critical cases. So initially, the hospitals had run out of this drug. There was a lot of black marketeering happening, and people were getting duped and they were getting fake medicines. So that is when the government decided to systematically crack down on these fraudulent practices. So within a day, all the posts on Twitter and social media related to this particular drug They were completely removed. And even today, if you go on Twitter and if you do a quick search on Remdesivir, maybe put the name of an Indian city, it will not take you to a citizen-generated post. It would probably take you to a PDF document which has a list of drug officers' names and the numbers whom you need to contact in order to procure that drug. So this was after the government decided to enter the online space, and this is how they started leveraging the platform. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a work in progress, and since this was something that happened so recently, and I'm still exploring, and I would love to know from all of you what your thoughts are. But some of the questions that I continue to explore are, using the social media, is it a space where both the government or the official sources should coexist along with these volunteer-driven sources, or should it be independently led by these citizen-led sources? Or is it only, what is most useful during a crisis situation? These are some of the questions that I continue to explore. And yeah, with this, I come to the end of my presentation. And yeah, I look forward to your thoughts and feedback. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Great, Rennie. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation and real insight to what's going on the ground in India and the part of digital responses to that. So can I open the floor for questions and comments? Anand.
Rini, thank you very much. Indeed, a very good presentation. And the comment I made was about the affordance you identified as collective action. I think it might be useful to see the connective action as well, because there's a slight difference between connective action and collective action. And although it's N is one observation in my own social media network where I saw the activities of Indian friends. What is Tony doing? He has it in his shelf. Tony, just in time. Thanks. So what it could be that you have identified both actions, so to speak. It could be that in your data there is connective and collective action, whereas collective is a bit more organized, formalized, or connective is less organized, structured in that sense, so to speak. But it may be that both are there. And regarding the question you raised at the end, it might be that there is the positive aspect that both the informal and the formal structures can empower or provide citizen empowerment and self-help next to the help the government is providing. So they can be allies, so to speak. So there is a, let's say, a positive aspect to twist the answer for your research question as you posted at the end. Tony, that's a good book you mentioned. I think that is useful for Rini.
Very much so. Tanya had a
What is
hand up,
Tanya saying?
but I think she was coming on the same point. Go ahead, Tanya.
Yeah, I just wrote in the chat. I was about to make exactly the same point about, wondering whether you'd seen any evidence of connective action, Rini. So Anand, you sort of read my mind. I lowered my hand, Tony. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, maybe Tanya will come back later on methodology, like how to take this piece of research forward and what kind of methods might be useful. I think there are some points about your conceptual framework that Becky might want to pick up on the affordances. Richard is here, and I know might want to pick up on the role of intermediaries. For my part, I just wanted to say, maybe have a look at the existing literature on crisis mapping. So crisis mapping is different in the sense that it's map-based, about visual mapping, but most crisis mapping projects quickly turn into logistics effort. So how to move oxygen from A to B, or how to find medical supplies. So I would be surprised if you didn't find useful points of reference and conceptual framings in the literature on crisis mapping. So that's definitely worth a look. In terms of affordances, I think there's a lot further that you could go. So the most self-evident affordance of digital for collective action, you've already started to look at, but I think there are lots of other affordances that you talked across, and others that it would be worth thinking through. So one of the affordances that you mentioned, I don't know if you used the word affordances to talk about it, but the fact that in a situation where you wanted to reduce the number of vectors and the number of times you come into contact with other people, how do you get oxygen? The affordance of digital is that you can immediately broadcast to millions of people information and requests whilst remaining remote and safe. But all of the affordances are not positive. So you talked about the fact that once you put your mobile phone online, it tends to stay permanently online, unless you're carefully curating it and delete it, so that even after the event, you may be receiving multiple communications forever and a day from other people who are still desperate for that medicine or that oxygen. So this is a kind of a negative affordance of digital. How do you make that temporal in a kind of a Snapchat way as opposed to a Facebook way? But we also saw in your images some other affordances. So you showed images of how people had visually represented the ask and chosen the language, and that agility, the affordance of modifiability to quickly be able to change, update, mark as found, are important affordances in a crisis mapping situation. Other suggestions, comments, or feedback for Rini? What are you planning to do with this next, Rini? What do you see as the way forward methodologically?
I think I really need more data, because at the moment it's very, as I mentioned in the beginning, it has its limitations, honestly. So, and it is definitely catering to the settings of my mobile phone, my location, and all of those things. So I need to decide how I can find data so that I can diversify my data, honestly, to understand what exactly was happening, and then build on further arguments. And also the aspect about the government's entry, I think there's a lot more digging that can go into it. Right now, those were very evident forms of action that the government took, something very on the surface, but it was also happening at multiple levels. So I think that aspect also needs to be explored in order to come to a balanced argument about the coexistence, or just a balanced argument about both the citizen-led side of it and also the government's side of it.
Yeah, obviously you're working in very, very challenging circumstances. So when you're trying to research something that's where all parts of it are moving dynamically, and trying to decide what is your frame, what is your time frame, what's your conceptual frame is very challenging, because dramatic things keep happening, which cause you to question whether you're asking the right question or using the right time frame or the right conceptual framework. So at some point you just have to make a choice and stick with it. But congratulations for getting this in, because I know you know, the context that you're working in is unimaginable for us, and to be able to keep your head together enough to share this learning with us is remarkable. So thank you for persevering and being here with us today. Okay.
Thank you, Anand and Becky, for the links that you've shared. I'll definitely look them up and get in touch with you offline as well. Thank you. Over to you, Tony.
So thank you very much, Rini, and we're ready to pass over to Corelli for the third and final presentation. Corelli, if you want to start sharing your screen, please do so, and whenever you're ready to begin.
Is it showing?
Yes, we see
Perfect.
what we're supposed to be seeing.
Perfect. So good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Tony mentioned, I'm Corelli Alvarado, and I will be presenting the paper on mobilizing a new feminism in shrinking spaces, specifically the case of the glitter revolution in Mexico. The gap that the paper sets to address is that existing literature on closing civic space, and in particular contentious politics literature, is largely gender blind, and it rarely includes a gender analysis. Hence, the research question addressed is, how have feminist movements mobilized in context of civic closure? So I will first present the proposed framework, then I will proceed to present the glitter revolution as a case study, and then I will go to explore 3 dimensions of the movement: claiming spaces, using contentious repertoires, and polarizing responses. So civic spaces can be understood as environment in which citizens and civil society organizations can organize, participate, and communicate hindrance. So using the civicus definition of it. So in recent years, there has been a global trend of closing civic spaces for participation and engagement. And just as a side note, Mexico is actually classified as repressed. So it does fit into that definition. And there's growing evidence that has identified an increased vulnerability and attacks towards women, particularly in context of civic space shrinkage, both by UN Women, but also by academics. So echoing UN Women, actually, the efforts to systematically examine the implications of inclusive democracy and representation on gender interests, and in particular, what are the implications of civic space shrinkage, are actually quite dispersed. So what this framework attempts to do is to bring them together. So I've put together different literature to do that. And the first thing that I will say is sort of looking and reviewing at the literature. What this framework says is that in context of civic space shrinkage, feminist movements mobilize through claiming spaces, both online and offline. So often, the shrinkage of civic space leads to movements need to claim new spaces for participation. And one characteristic of these spaces is they're normally operated by less powerful actors from or against the power holder. Since the 2000s, the digital revolution has actually created and expanded new online civic spaces, which can be seen to represent new claimed spaces, as Hossein et al. Mentioned. So these online civic spaces can then serve as refuges and organizing spaces to express identities, rehearse resistance, form policy demands, and even mobilize and influence social actions. The second aspect that this framework sets is that, again, one of the ways in which feminists mobilize is through increasing radicalization and polarization. So the shrinkage of civic spaces can be understood as a strategy of exclusion or repression of conflict, which Creasy actually in literature on political opportunity structures identified to influences polarization on social movements, and it leads to increased opposition with the state instead of moderation and cooperation, which tends to happen in different contexts. So this increased opposition is actually in line with Tilly and Taro's view that new claim-making rounds can threaten and provide windows of opportunity for previously inactive actors, thus engendering counter-movement. And this also leads to the third area that I will be speaking for, which is using contentious politics repertoires. So De La Porta observes that as counter-protesters, such as police or state, respond with force, social movements tend to intensify their tactics and radicalize their claims. And as Tilly and Taro state, violent repertoires are commonly used, but not only because of the use by these movements, but also as a result of the interaction of protesters and the forces of order. Thus, contention repertoires are often deployed in context of repression and conflict or shrinkage of civic spaces. So this will be the framework that I will use to actually look at a particular case study, which is the glitter revolution. So from August 2019, the feminist Mexican movement became one of the most radical and innovative in the country over the last decades. And what it has done, it has created unprecedented mobilizations that have actually been categorized as a landmark and a confirmation of the right of feminism in Mexico. And this revolution, what it has at its center is the protest against increasing levels and prevalence of gender-based violence, the impunity surrounding it, and in particular, femicides. And it has been seen to have 4 big characteristics. One are highly visible street mobilizations, the use of tactics, which are often referred to in mainstream media as violent, the coordinating and protesting via social media, which is quite new for the feminist movement in Mexico, and the focus on, again, the claim on gender-based violence. And one other thing that has been mentioned a lot by literature is, and this is sort of a global trend, but that young feminists are the ones that are protesting within this movement. So again, going back to the framework and looking at the first bit, which is the claiming of new spaces. So the inception of this new wave of feminism actually can be situated in sporadic mobilizations that occurred at the National Autonomous University in Mexico from 2017 and 2019. However, as the movement emerged, it seemed to be confined to the university and making very localized demands. However, it was not until between July and August 2019 that 3 sexual assaults by police officers in Mexico City were reported. And what happened is that as this sort of reports of sexual assaults by police officers to women in museums, in the street, and in a hotel were reported, nothing seemed to happen. Actually, mainstream media barely covered it. There's an estimate that only 5 media articles were published on these things. And there wasn't really any action that the government was taking. In fact, the police officers that were accused sort of came up and said that that wasn't true, and the government supported them. So that led to this young feminists inside of them to then sort of leave the confinements of the university and began to protest through street protests. The first thing they did was mobilize around 500 women and feminist collectives, mostly from the university, on 12th of August 2019. And they went to the Minister of Public Safety in Mexico City and called for the punishment against these alleged perpetrators. And what happened was, as they were questioning the Minister of Public Safety, he was unable to provide any information on the cases or gender-based violence more generally in Mexico, and in Mexico City in particular. So what the protesters did is they actually threw pink glitter at him, and you can see the picture on the screen when that pink glitter was thrown. And that sort of appalled by the gesture, what he did is they closed the doors on the feminists, and they refused to make any other, start those conversations or have any contact. And so that's when the name, the glitter revolution, actually emerged for this movement, which that actually led to, a protest, and they started to do spray paints on public buildings. They began a fire. And so what happened there was a farther shrinkage of civic spaces. So Mexico's city mayor declared the marches to be a provocation to the government, and the use of provocation was actually quite contentious in itself, because normally what happens in Mexico is when women are blamed and re-victimized after any type of gender-based violence, they are always told that they provoked the person because they were dressed in a certain way or they did a certain thing. So the fact that the government is using that word, they were provoking us, is actually quite significant into how the movement actually mobilized. And what the government mainly criticized is that they were generating violence when they were protesting violence. So that seemed quite unusual of the movement, according to the government. And this were actually an informal tactic to shrink civic spaces through this smear campaigns and the questioning of what the movement was starting to do. And so what the movement began to do was use online civic spaces to try to organize, but also protest and sort of create this counter narrative against what the mainstream media and the government in particular was doing. So they called for a mobilization through a hashtag called "They don't look after me, they rape me," and demanding justice is not provoking. And that was actually one of the biggest feminist marches that have happened in Mexico. They took the main street in Mexico, and then as the protest was happening, they began to and quote unquote vandalize metro bus stations, so transport stations. They set fire outside government buildings, and they painted the facade of a police station. But they also went to the most landmark monument in Mexico, which is the Angel of Independence, located in the main street. And they actually spray painted different messages. Those messages are called pintas, because they refuse to categorize them as graffitis, but rather just a protest message that is talking about gender-based violence. So just to highlight sort of what was the centrality of the framing of this movement, those are some of the chants that were used on the second march on 16 August. And I think one of the ways to really sum up the demands is the image that's in the left, which is more glitter, less rapes, less disappearances, and less murders, which I think that really talks about the centrality of gender-based violence that the movement had. So the second part of the framework actually talked about using contentious tactics, And so since the first demonstrations, the movement adopted what Tilly and Tara referred to as contentious repertoires to share their claims. And what is really interesting is that from the beginning, so from that first attempt of the government to close discourse and close that opportunity to participate in discussions, the tone of voice of the movement has been intolerant, desperate, and utterly outraged by the insufficient government response. And therefore, it seems that they have resorted to quote unquote violent and vandalistic tactics to shake the status quo and to really shine a spotlight on the issue of gender-based violence. So those are sort of three images from that first big march. The first one is the fire that was ignited outside a police station. The second one is sort of the pintas that were done on police buildings. And then the third one, again, the most relevant and most covered one, which were the pintas at the Angel of Independence as a landmark building. So what is at the center? You know, why are this contentious repertoires? And I try to sort of go back to the literature and understand why perhaps there's more contentious repertoires that sort of go into what are considered violent. How can they be understood? And there were three things that I believe are at the center. The first is outrage, the second is frustration, and the third is urgency. So in Mexico, 63 out of every 100 women report having suffered gender-based violence, which is a really huge statistic. But even more than that, every 2.3 minutes, a woman is raped in Mexico, and 10 women a day are killed. And nothing seems to be happening. So this has really just generated sort of a point of outrage and the need to do something, sort of shake that status quo and really make a difference. The second thing that we have seen is that around 88.3% of all gender crimes that are reported are left unpunished, which is a really high statistic around impunity. And the statistics are even higher for rape and femicides. For femicides, it's estimated that only 3% actually result in a sentence. So, and not only that, but even when women do report, they are re-victimized. So actually some of the first protests that happened were because a woman was killed through being burnt. And the pictures were actually publicized in all of the media, mainstream media. So it's about this re-victimization of women when they are, suffer some type of violence. And then the final thing that's really important is that while former waves of feminism in Mexico dialogued and negotiated with this government, this new wave began to view the state as the perpetrator of the violence because of that impunity and because of that lack of response, and because it had been police officers that had raped people. So there was this urgency to hold the state to account, which sort of, again, then made them have to change their tactics instead of negotiation to more confrontation and this contentious politics that began to happen. And then the third aspect of the framework that I want to talk about are the polarizing responses and a bit of radicalization within the movement itself. So in context of certain spaces, we have seen social media to become a fundamental tool that have allowed women to assemble and coordinate demonstrations both on and offline. They have been connected through different parts of the country. So it has become a more coordinated movement that doesn't just center around Mexico City. But also it has provided a safe space for women's collective care. You know, when violence seems to be the norm on public spaces, sort of when feminist movements have created the safe spaces where they're able to support each other, say, I believe you, I support you, let's go and work together to solve whatever is happening. And they have also increased the visibility of the actions undertaken, sort of providing this alternative outlet to traditional media that seem to be replicated, these messages and this smear campaigns that the government had launched. So this visibility of the protest and their repertoires have generating this polarizing discourses. On one side is those that consider a legitimate and civic response, and they see, you know, justice as a way to demand civil reparation. And that particularly has been supported through 3 different hashtags, which is they don't look after us, they rape me, which I've already said that was the first mobilization. Not one more, which is sort of legacy of the movement that began in Argentina, which is ni una más, so around the same thing. And then they also use the hashtags they are killing us. And then the most sort of the newer hashtag that has been used is first women, then walls, as a way to say, stop worrying about the walls, worry about the gender-based violence that we have. And one of the most important things that has occurred in that is when a collective was born, which is called Restauradoras con Glitter, or Glitter Restorers, which are basically, you know, cultural heritage restorers that called for reimagining the role of monuments and historical sites. And as a specialist, they had a significant role in promoting this trend, and they actually called for a strike. So even to date, the pintas at the Angel of Independence have not been restored because all the women restorers actually refused to do so. So you can still see it when you go to Mexico City. And then on the other hand, there were those that considered the movement to be an illegitimate performance, and they were being judged, they judged it as uncivil and inadequate use of vandalism to make themselves be heard. They believed that it didn't really support. So this counter force emerged using 2 hashtags in particular, not like that woman, and they don't represent me. And so I've actually been looking at the hashtags, and one of the things that is quite interesting is that those hashtags are mainly used by men instead of women, which, you know, just goes to talk about this environment that happens around women and gender-based violence. So just to say, the second thing that has happened is a sustained collective action. This polarizing response have actually supported the sustainability of the protests, and 2 things in particular are quite relevant. The first is on the 8th of March 2020, so right before COVID began. It was the most historic march that Mexico has ever seen around gender-based violence. Where just alone in Mexico City, over 500,000 women protested, and you can see a picture on the screen. But also, I think what was most relevant is for the first time in Mexican history, women decided they also wanted to do a strike. So on the 9th of March, they called for a general strike throughout Mexico City, where 22 million women throughout the country actually participated. And it is estimated that $1.5 million were lost by the lack of participation of women in the economy, in workspaces, in schools. And basically it was, don't let people see a woman today. Let's show what a life without women would be, because if we continue to have this prevalence levels of violence, that's what's going to happen. And then the last, so just to close, basically, we can see that the Mexican feminist movement exemplifies the vision that in times of crisis, such as the shrinkage of civic spaces, new forms of interaction and protest are found to perform collective action, basically. So in particular, we can see that as women interests are threatened and the spaces for their participation are reduced, feminist movements tend to increase their mobilization through 3 characteristics: claiming new spaces for participation both on and offline, increasing their radicalization, contributing to the polarization of existing conflicts, and the use of contentious politics repertoires. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Great graphics as well, and really compelling presentation. So I'm opening the floor for feedback, suggestions for Kareli.
I have a question, but I can't see the raise hand button.
That's okay. We're just go ahead.
Kareli, very inspiring presentation and nice graphics. I was wondering, because the use of the hashtags, as you said, it had a kind of gender bias. Men were using and women felt forced, or were they trolled? Because I was curious why they didn't use the hashtag. Is it because sometimes they feel that they get more online violence? And the second question I have is there a link with the diaspora, the Mexicans living in the United States, and how do you say, enhancing the message online and creating new funding or organizational capabilities? Is there something you found in your data?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. The first thing around the hashtags, it's actually, you know, women are constantly trolled online, specifically if they support sort of the feminist movement, especially at the beginning. So I think in the first bit, so the first protest, lots of Mexicans, and this is sort of a more anecdotal evidence, but lots of Mexicans actually were against the actions that were being taken in this more contentious repertoires. And I think it took a while for this message to get across as, you know, why are you being so upset around walls? What is it that you're really upset about? So at the beginning, I think there was definitely trolling against women, and that's why sort of this online spaces became, in a way, they were a contentious space, but also a safe space, because as one woman was trolled, then lots of other women sort of emerged to protect that person and sort of control that environment a bit more. And generally, I think it's just the use of the hash. So the counter movement hashtags were mainly used by men, but I think it has more to do with gender-based violence in a different way rather than a particular effort. So it's quite significant that the hashtag was "they don't represent me," and it was used as if it were women not representing women, but it was actually more men using the hashtag and complaining about the use. And you know, one of the things that they kept doing was showing pictures of women that they considered to be real feminists, not this, you know, so they kept showing pictures, for example, of the people that were cleaning the streets after the protests. And so they were like, those are real feminists, not you, that are protesting. And I think that has actually been quite significant, particularly because as more civic spaces are being shrunk, women are now protesting with their faces covered as a way of sort of covering their identity. So when they go into marches, women often do have their face covered, so they are not recognized. And so that has actually increased the message by men that they're not real feminists and that they don't really, you know, they're this conservative group and they don't represent women's interests. And I forgot your second question, actually. Sorry.
The diaspora link. United States funding, mobilizing, enhancing the message, because protest needs oxygen in the sense of attention. So that's why I thought.
No, I think that's a really relevant question, particularly given the size of the Mexican diaspora in the U.S. basically. And I think it has been supported quite significantly, especially as the levels of violence have increased, the Mexican diaspora in the US in particular. And I think New York, it mainly actually has done lots of mobilizations against gender-based violence in Mexico. But one interesting thing is that they have actually taken this intersectional approach of saying, well, it's not just all women, but if we go into more rural women, or if we go into migrant women. So if we go, so they're sort of try to shine this light into looking at other women besides this white middle class women living in the capital city, which often the movement tended to focus on. So I think there was an attempt. Unfortunately, we've also continued to have problems around migration. So there have been several movements around migrants and caravans.
Guatemala, etc.
Yeah, and I think as those sort of things happen, then that sort of moves away the light from the feminist protests. But one interesting thing that has happened and that we continue to see as this revolution continues to unravel, because it is important to say that, you know, it's still sort of happening, is that the government, the executive, so mainly the president, has classified the feminist movement as its opposition. So because he continuously calls them an opposition to the government, now lots of the Mexican diaspora living in other parts.
New president?
So the president that began in 2018. So as the protests began, there was also sort of a shift in regime, and the president has said that the feminist movement, it's opposition, and that it's being fueled by conservatives, which is, he's a left wing, so the conservatives would be his opposition. And so what has happened is lots of people are supporting the feminist movement as a way of opposing the government. So now, you know, that's a whole new research, because I sort of focused on the emergence of the movement. But if we go into what is happening currently, it's really interesting to see how lots of different groups are making coalitions with the feminists in order to sort of serve as an opposition to the president, which continues to have increased power in this, you know, democratic shrinkage that's happening.
It seems in all three presentations we come towards these kinds of observations, like the anti-vaxxers and the right wing and the left wing, and in India the same, and you notice this. So this is interesting to see this kind of horseshoe approach, that political interests are covert powers. There is an agenda. By the way, on a personal level, if I may, one of my friends, she is a Mexican professor, Cecilia Uribe, is one of the first, actually, she is the only theoretical physicist professor in Mexico, a female. I'd like to introduce you to her. She's, by the way, now living, I think, in the United States, and once in a while teaching in Mexico and then in Switzerland, working for CERN. Because I do think it is good to expand your network and your research to the ones who can convey the message.
Yeah, definitely.
A little bit activism on a personal note.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, I'll do.
Vicky.
Well, that was such a brilliant presentation, and I was privileged to have a kind of preview of it a couple of weeks ago. I'd like to continue a thread that Tanya got me brought up yesterday, and that I've been thinking about a lot since, about how you engage women who might not be online, so women are offline or have kind of limited connectivity. And it strikes me, well, one of the things, given that you had like 500,000 people on the streets and just extraordinary scale of protest, this seems like a real success story, in that the message must have travelled, like not all of the people on the streets were there because they heard about it through Twitter. So is there any kind of insights that you have about that? And I'd also like to hear your thoughts about, it was really interesting when you said, oh, well, when women got trolled, there was a kind of, everyone kind of bubbled around them and supported them. So any kind of reflections on that kind of feminist digital self-care and how effective that was as a strategy against trolls?
Yeah.
In presentation, I love your work.
Thank you. So I think on engaging women that might not be online, a lot of it has to do with this polarizing response, to be honest. And I think it's quite interesting that this counter movement, what they did was amplify the message of the actual movement. So as you know, several and most actual sort of mainstream media began to cover as, oh, they're doing this, and now they're calling for a no protest, then people were like, huh, maybe I should go to that protest. So, you know, it's quite interesting that it was this counter discourse that actually amplified the discourse and sort of began to put centrality on the gender-based violence. I think the second thing that perhaps has led to that is the experience of gender-based violence is something that, you know, women feel every day. So if you have 60% of the population experiencing some sort of violence, I think what has happened is sort of this mouth-to-mouth conversion. And again, this is very anecdotal, and I have to find a way to put it into research. But as a Mexican that was there, I've seen a shift, you know, even from my own family, from the first time saying, oh, that, for example, my mom, she condemned the first protest so much And then the last protest, this 8th of March, she was like, oh, we have to go. That's something that we have to do because it's completely, we can't leave gender-based violence to be like that. Which, and that has, as I talk to other people, that has something that has been consistently happening. So actually one of the things that was used on the march that I mentioned with 500,000 people on Twitter, again, going back to Twitter, but it was, thank you, welcome sister, we were waiting for you. And that was something that was really consistently used, as in, you don't have to have been feminist all your life, but if you're coming now, this is a welcoming space, so welcome. And I think that was something that really people began to use a lot. And so that motivated people that perhaps hadn't engaged with feminism, even that are not on social media, to sort of get that message of perhaps this is somewhere where I have to be. And again, what they used is they used commonly the stories of gender-based violence and this femicides that we continue to see every day on just mainstream media or newspapers, or the president talks about it. So I think that was one of the ways in which that happened. And I think the strike actually supported that a lot too. So a lot of, for example, companies, they allowed, which is, a strike that's allowed is really a really interesting thing, but they would send lots of messages saying, if women don't want to come, we understand. That's fine. You won't be punished, you won't suffer this. And a lot of those companies actually included data on gender-based violence, which I think really supported this increased awareness. Even sort of, again, quite interestingly, but in Mexico City, the government originally said that women that did not do work, they would be punished. And after lots of backlash, they sort of changed that and said, okay, if women don't want to come on the strike, that would be okay. And so a high number of public servants in Mexico City actually participated. And I think as women began to participate in this thing, and you actually went to the street and there were no women, like there are lots of really interesting pictures in Mexico City, obviously, as the capital was much higher, but of women really not being present and trying to follow this strike. So I think that really made an impact into this awareness and how people have been able to mobilize even outside social media, though the beginning is through social media. And then on the second question around self-care, I think it's been quite interesting, as there is definitely lots of backlash against women, especially at the beginning of the protest, as I mentioned. And I think what has happened is that there are lots of feminist collectives that sort of focus on seeing who's being trolled. And so they're normally, or if someone is being trolled, they call to this feminist collectives, which are the most commonly known ones, which continue to change over time. But then what happens is you sort of go into whoever is being attacked and everyone is like, I believe you, I'm here with you. So I think it's this counter sort of space where when you're being trolled, to also have the support system of I'm here. And I think that has been something that has happened really amazingly with the movement in Mexico. Whereas now, if a case happens of someone denouncing gender-based violence, particularly, focus more on not femicides, because that's obviously difficult to focus, but more rapes or other types of violence, there's an automatic response overwhelmingly of feminist collective saying, we're here, what do you need? And you can see that quite clearly. And so I think that has been really interesting in this. And normally there's this hashtags of I'm here with Laura, we are all Wendy, we are, so they automatically create this hashtag to support the person that's being trolled. And I think that's quite an interesting way in which social media has actually done that role of supporting each other, particularly during COVID times. And I can send you, there's quite an interesting paper that they did on the feminist movement and self-care. It's more around social media and how it's operated, but they do include sort of interviews with feminists around this space for self-care and social media.
And these feminist, the sort of collectives that you're saying that will kind of leap in and support other women, are these kind of formally organized groups, or are they kind of ad hoc groups that have just kind of like connected with each other on Facebook or on social media? Is it kind of an ad hoc thing?
No, I think they're organized. Because so for example, one of those is the collective that called for the national strike. So it's moved our collectives that already exist, but they sort of have made it. A lot of what they said on interviews is, because we've suffered that violence online, we want to be able to support other people. So I think it's not even their main job. It's just that an automatic response that they do. Whereas when perhaps that's not happening, they have their formal things going on. I think what has been quite ad hoc is the creation of networks between those collectives. So they used to be quite dispersed, whereas now I feel that there is more coordination around what's happening. And I hope, so I'm going to actually start doing interviews with feminists in Mexico. So hopefully I'll have more information on that. But we can actually see more networks happening and those connections. And I think what you see is perhaps if one of them is not made aware, they're automatically tagged. So they know that they should sort of come and what's happening.
Anyone who hasn't spoken yet have feedback?
Hi, Tony. Can I
please, Richard, go ahead.
Hiya. Yeah. I just want to ask a couple of things. The first thing was just a comment. I think, did you say the cost would be $1.5 million?
Yeah.
I think that may be out by a factor of 1,000. Yeah. I think it's billion. But I wanted to ask a couple of things. First of all, you talked about sort of safe spaces, and your answer to Becky gave that sense of sort of how an open digital space can be made a bit safer for women. But I wondered if there'd been any creation of closed digital spaces just for women, that they'd created their own networks where they could be, if you like, sort of truly safe. So that's the first question about closed digital spaces. And the other one was really about impact of the glitter revolution. I wondered if there's any evidence. You gave a kind of sense of perhaps in terms of politics, what some of the slightly surprising impact has been, that a left-wing president would declare feminists to be the enemy. But I wondered beyond that if there'd been other kind of perhaps more tangible impacts in terms of the role of the police or legislation or other actions.
Yeah. So thank you for those questions around the closed digital spaces. I think that actually goes back to what was being mentioned yesterday. I think WhatsApp has been the closed digital space. It hasn't been another social media. So Twitter or Instagram really haven't been that closed. They've been quite open, but WhatsApp groups have actually been formed. A lot of them more at state-based levels. So lots of, if you're a feminist, you can come here, and then people are approving and checking that. So I think there's definitely that safe space online through WhatsApp groups, which are obviously, as it was being mentioned yesterday, it's way more difficult to measure sort of what's happening around there and how it's working. But I think that has been a way to doing that. And around impact, I think, we're still seeing sort of the impact. Two things I would say that are quite just and have been attributed to the feminist movement are two pieces of legislation. One is called the Ley Olimpia, which is actually because Olimpia is a woman whose pictures were leaked, sort of private pictures were leaked. And so there's now a law in Mexico to prosecute anyone who leaks private pictures or shares pictures that you've shared with that person, which is, so that has been approved as a gain of the feminist movement that took the streets and sort of protested and organized around that law. And the second one is called Ley Ingrid, again, because Ingrid was a person, I think I actually mentioned her, is a femicide where she was burnt, and the pictures were posted on all of the mainstream media channels of her. And so, of the murder. And so the law is that any media that re-victimizes women through sharing that type of information, again, can be prosecuted. So those are two emerging pieces of legislation that I think are definitely a gain of the feminist movement. I think more significant ones around gender-based violence, which we're trying to, one of the things they claimed at the beginning was the need to declare Mexico City as a place with a gender alert because of the high level of femicides, which was done, but it wasn't accompanied by an increase of budget. And actually we have seen a decrease. So one of the also not so positive impacts of the glitter revolution is a decreased budget for mostly all of the things related to gender. And in fact, we have an institute in Mexico, which is the Institute Against Discrimination. And the person responsible actually left, well, was asked to leave the institute, and another person was put by the president, which again, that has been claimed to be related to the movement and the support that perhaps she was showing to the movement. So yeah, it's quite polarizing responses also and impacts.
In terms of impact, I mean, one thing that might be interesting if you're doing interviews would be perhaps to interview police officers to understand whether they're feeling pressure, and maybe, you know, other stakeholders rather than those, of course, you know, just within the movement, those outside, to understand whether they're changing their priorities at all as a result, in terms of investigations and so on, as a result of the movement.
Yeah, definitely. I'll do that. That's quite interesting.
Other contributions or feedback?
Can I just ask a very quick follow-up? As an old man with very few friends, my WhatsApp groups stretch to about 10 people at most. So I don't really know what the capacity of WhatsApp is. I mean, are these huge WhatsApp groups potentially?
Yeah. So for example, I'm in one in Mexico City, which has, I will tell you how many members now. But yeah, they're quite, I think they go to their highest capacity, which is around 1,000 people, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so this one has 800 people. Which...
Just to leap in on that, not on the topic of Rich not having any friends, but I know we're working with some partners on our Countering Backlash project where they're looking at Telegram in Brazil, and because Telegram doesn't have an upper limit on groups, and they were saying there were kind of Bolsonaro sponsored groups with like 300,000 people in them, so they're like mass kind of platforms for kind of broadcasting disinformation.
And therefore bigger than some newspapers.
Yeah.
In terms of their reach. Yeah, so currently one of the things that we can carry on talking about offline is where you go with this research next. In terms of all the papers that we had for the 2 sessions that we've run with DSA, your paper is already significantly further developed than the others. And I think that means that you should already be thinking about where to publish. And there are a number of different directions that you can go in, some of which are digital and some of which are not. I mean, you could be looking at kind of mainstream development studies journals where the digital content would not need to be significant. Or you could go in the direction of kind of IT for development journals where it would need to be central. And those choices will need to inform what kind of questions you're asking people as you continue the research. So I think that they're kind of significant issues. One way of keeping your options open would be to think of this as developing a book with chapters, where some chapters are about contentious politics, but other chapters are about digital contentious politics, so that you can kind of separate those strands out and keep open the possibility of a whole book, or of submitting different articles to different journals. So one line of discussion that we can continue later is, if we were to think more about the digital, what needs further thought? And so I think that, you know, part of that would be documenting to what extent does digital matter in these contentious feminist politics in the glitter revolution. One way of asking yourself those questions is to say, could all of this happen without any digital? In order to then be able to ask yourself the follow-up question of, then what exactly has been, is the ongoing role of digital? What does it make possible that's not otherwise possible, which is the affordances question, right? What new action possibilities is the use of different digital technologies affording women engaged in this process. And some part of that's about reach, and some of it's about mobilization, some of it's about counter narratives, some of it's about safety and care. But that next level of analysis is really pushing into those different affordances, documenting them, asking questions about them until they clarify themselves in your mind. And then moving away from the digital, I think there are some really important kind of movement and political questions that are not necessarily at all digital, but given your title, I think movement is significant, right? So this is a women's movement. It's got different kinds of movement, and that movement's happening in different kinds of spaces. But I think the ultimate movement question is what has moved and what has not moved. All right, so what have been the successes? What movement has happened? What's different now than was in the past, but equally important is the question is what has not moved, what has not changed, and what therefore still needs to be done. And given that the word revolution is deeply embedded in the name of this movement, that's a conceptual tool that's available to you to have that debate with yourself and with those people who become participants in your research. So, in a Rosa Luxemburg sense, is this reform or revolution? What is the movement about? And of those changes that have happened thus far, do any of them qualify for what you choose to define as revolution, or do they qualify as what you might decide to define as reform, or are they actually conformism, or actually parts of the movement being absorbed into and co-opted back into its traditional politics, for want of a better word? So, and I think that will help push through your kind of the theoretical conceptual component of your research and take that to the next level, because you've done an astonishing job of describing the situation. And I've had the opportunity to read, I think, 3 versions of your paper already. and you do an outstanding, really, really good job of articulating your argumentation is really, really strong. The way you work through the literature to build up the argument is really impressive. So it's not a criticism, but the next thing is, where can you go from here? How much further can you push that? And I would be tempted, given where you are, to play more with movement and space, and with revolution and those age-old debates about revolution or reform, and what does that mean for the glitter movement in Mexico.
Tony, just to quickly add to the options that you present, I think that the journal Feminist Media Studies would actually, would be your paper would be a great fit, I think, for that journal as well. So the 2 options Tony presents, but I think that's a third kind of space for work like this, and I think it's actually really close to submission. But maybe just have a look at the journal. In their latest issues, there's a lot of digital media work as well, and a huge shortage of work from the global south. So they're always looking for work, from different regions. And I think it would, I think it would be a great fit for that journal. So that could be one avenue to publish.
Thank you so much.
Richard, if it was to put the IT at the center of the story, where would be good places for Corelli to be looking?
information communication and society, or digital journalism, probably. Sorry to butt in, but I thought of that. It's just that your work, I think, has more strengths theoretically from the sort of feminist movement side of things than a lot of those digital IT journals are methodologically quite quantitative and rigorous, and I think it could be quite boring to shift your focus to looking at sort of the digital and tweets. And I think it's much more interesting to look at the arguments around civic space and feminist movements. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents. Maybe Richard has a better answer.
No, that's fine. I mean, yeah, you're right that the story is probably the bigger one rather than the digital. Obviously, it would be information technology for development, I guess, would be an obvious one, which is not particularly or not necessarily so quantitative in its approach.
Great. Any last comments before we round up? I think we had extremely strong presentations today, and across the 2 days, a really wide variety of presentations, all of which spoke to those kind of central themes about opening and closing of civic space. All of them spoke to the role of digital in both opening and closing civic space, and some strong themes came through, as Anand was saying, both about intermediaries, about the role of digitalization and securitization, and the role of government. So really good and useful conversation. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking part. And of course, the conversations will continue.